Welcome to Chapter 11. And in this chapter, we're going to focus on jobs and time tracking. And you say to yourself, well, we have customers and invoices and things like that. Why do we need jobs? And the reality is that many of your customers may have multiple jobs assigned to them. For example, I might have one client that I'm doing multiple kinds of cases for. Maybe I'm doing their taxes, and maybe I'm drafting their will, and maybe they also have some sort of a court matter going on. And so, I'm allocating my time separately for these particular matters. And from a customer standpoint, they may want or need their bill broken down into the various discrete matters that I'm doing for them. It may have to do with maybe a deduction for their taxes. And so if some of the stuff I'm doing for them is business and some is personal, they don't want the personal stuff intermingled with the business stuff on the invoice that they get. And so separating it out will help them to do that. And that's just one example of why we might want to use jobs as opposed to just billing strictly to customers. What we're also going to look at doing is allocating our time to these particular jobs, as opposed to just having employees track their payroll and saying, okay, I worked 7 hours today. Well, that's great. How did you work your 7 hours? How do I pass that cost that I've now incurred onto a client, or how do I allocate that to a particular client or file or project so that I know whether or not what I'm charging is keeping me profitable? And if I bill your time out to the client, I need to know what that is so that I can make sure to bill the client appropriately for the amount of time that you may have spent on their file. And so if we were using a manual system, we would have a job subsidiary ledger. And in QuickBooks, this is all done out of our Customer Center, which we saw way back at the beginning of the course, but we will revisit for these purposes. So within the Customer Center, we've got a file for each customer. And if there are specific jobs that we've defined, those will also be attached to the particular customer. So we don't have jobs just free floating. We have customers that may not necessarily be attached to a job, but if we have a job, it is attached to the customer. And so this, again, is the Customer Center, which should look familiar. And this is where we will go to add our job. And I'll go over to the live version in a few minutes to do that. And so under New Customer and Job, we click the Add Job and then enter all of the appropriate information, noting that there are various tabs here that we want to make sure that we're set up with the customer. But this is particularly the job that's going to be set up within the customer. And so in this particular example, they've got 3 jobs under the kind of the umbrella of the customer's name. So we've got Hamilton Hotels, and indented from there, we've got these 3 jobs, so that whether maybe we're purchasing some particular items that are then going to be turned around and used on a particular job. So we want to make sure that our employees are properly doing that so that we're correctly allocating the expenses toward the correct job, because we don't want the customer to call up and go, hey, I got this part billed on this bill for this job, and maybe they're turning around and passing on costs to customers. And so they need to make sure that our records are accurate so that their records can be accurate. And so again, as we have the various services and parts, we will allocate those to the particular job. And so in this case, and actually I'm going to stop here. We'll go over to the live version, and then we'll come back and talk about payroll expenses. So I have here Lynn's Music Studio, and we go to our customers, our customer center. But here we've got customers and jobs. And so we've got here the Highland School where we have various jobs. If I up, but I'll at least go through the steps so that you can see what those are. We've got all of the sort of main info for the customer here. And again, we just want to double check and make sure all of our other information is accurate. And now we get down to the job information. And so we can set up all the individual jobs. And when this job is done, when we don't want to clutter up our little dashboard over here with that information, we just click that the job is inactive. And in the manner in which we filter this screen here to the left helps us to be able to keep that clear and just see what we're working on now rather than what we've had since the beginning of time that our company has operated. So we would go through and enter all of this information here. We would have various job types potentially that we could do that might help us with our own internal accounting system in terms of as I've said before, I track my job, my work by practice area so that I can keep an eye on my revenue as it's coming in from the various sources, and I know whether or not I need to increase my marketing efforts in a particular area, for example. So I'm not actually going to save this here. We'll just cancel this for now and hop back over to the live version for payroll. Now I know we've spent a lot of time on payroll already, but what we haven't talked about is how we want to allocate payroll expenses to our particular jobs. And some of our payroll expenses are going to be things that we directly bill to another job. Some of them are really going to be part of our overall overhead, but we just want to keep track of them to know how our time's being spent. If one customer is maybe taking up a disproportionate amount of time in terms of our overhead than other customers, that's important to be aware of because that may be some lost cost opportunity, and that we might need to look at how we could better recover those costs. So in this case, we've got Harry Renee, who is an administrative assistant whose time is not billable, and Richard Henderson, a design assistant whose time is billable. Now, both of these individuals are going to allocate time to the jobs, but Richard's time is actually going to show up on the invoice, and we're going to directly pass that time on we're going to bill him out at a higher rate than we pay him. And the customer is going to pay hour for hour for the amount of time that Richard spends on the file, whereas Harry's going to spend time on the file, but it may be doing things like setting up the file, setting up the billing system, things like that for this particular customer account. But that's not something that we're going to pass on to the customer. That's going to be an overhead expense item that we maintain internally, but we want to track it. And so when we go to pay our employees, this is one way that we're going to allocate costs to the job. And we've gone through payroll pretty extensively, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over all of this, but I'll just click to the next menu and show you the screenshot of how that's going to look. And so on the preview paycheck window, we show that we've got various customer jobs that are based under this one umbrella customer where wages are being allocated to. And so you can see for this particular employee, Richard Henderson, how those hours are allocated. And again, this is all sort of review of the paychecks window. And So I'm over here under the payroll screen, and we're going to put in hourly wages. And then if I wanted to have some of it attributed to one, oops, I clicked enter too soon. But anyway, and we can move this a little bit so that we can see a little better. We can have intermediate level here, and oop, I keep hitting enter. But anyway, you get the idea as to how we are going to enter those by employee. And so I'm actually going to go through and delete these so that they don't scrub my data file. And I'll move on to the next video for creating an invoice for a job.